Thank you all for staying around. It's going to have a short post-show discussion to unpick some of the things that we've just seen in a fascinating performance by Seeta Patel. My name's Alex. I'm the creative producer here at Kala Sangam. To my left is Seeta Patel, who people here have seen performing, and I'm sure people watching live on our Facebook feed will be aware of her work. On my far right there we have Suhaiymah Manzoor Khan. I'm going to ask you both to talk a little bit about who you are as well. And this is Pauline Mayers, who's sitting to my right. Suhaiymah, do you want to just give everybody a brief, a very short snippet about who you are and what your work is, and maybe how it's relevant to the piece that we've seen this evening?
I'm a writer and spoken word poet, but I've got my background in history and post-colonial studies. And I do a lot of educational work around what it means to decolonize ourselves, our minds, our histories. And so I think this links really interestingly to what we just saw. I feel like I made so many notes that I'm not going to be able to talk about everything, but I think if I could just sort of draw on a few things that really stick out to me is that, obviously when it comes to history, we've got the kind of obvious point I think that Seeta makes, which is about who has the power of telling the past, really holds power over the present. But I think what was interesting was also the kind of question about autonomy. So what I thought was really interesting was that we never, we always heard the colonizer's voice, right? But we never heard from the other. And then we saw the other, but whenever we saw the other, it was only through this lens. And obviously that was a literally whitewashed lens. But I just thought that was really interesting because it speaks to questions now about when people are talking about reclaiming the past and decolonizing history. One of the issues that we have is that how do you find out that the quote that somebody has is, we don't know what we don't know. And I think that is very much the problem. And it's kind of like, I think what was really interesting for me was when you were on the other side of the screen, but you were also sort of wiping and kind of complicit in that whitewashing yourself. And I think that's interesting because it does pose this question about what does it mean to reclaim narratives if, in fact, everything is a narrative? But I guess the conclusion is whoever has the power to decide what the truth is has that ultimate kind of power of violence as well. So I'll let you speak and then maybe
Yeah, it's lots for us to unpick. Pauline, do you want to?
Yeah. I am a choreographer, theatre maker and writer. I'm based in Leeds, and a lot of my work includes participation in intimacy and is around identity, primarily mine, but looking through my experience, like what are the ways in which we can connect better to each other, and why do we have this ridiculous notion of skin colour as a thing, particularly in the 21st century, because it's kind of ridiculous. We've got other things to worry about. So that's it's true. Climate change is a big one. So yeah, that's kind of like my kind of background. I originally was a dancer, so kind of going into writing is a completely different thing for me. But the reason why I did that was actually in a way to reclaim myself and a bit of myself, and I felt very strongly that was what the piece, beautiful piece by the way. Yes, it was great. Yes. Again, there was so much to unpick in there. If I was to say one thing, I think it's that sense of stories being obscured, that we constantly have conversations or debates or arguments really about past histories that none of us really actually know about. Actually, I can kind of signal, for instance, that part of the reason why the black community came to Britain in 1948 is because there was over 10,000 West Indians who fought on behalf of Britain in World War II, and my great-great-uncle was part of that. And so when HMS Windrush came to Britain, it wasn't a group of black people coming from the Caribbean looking for golden pavements. It was full of people who had served in both the army and the RAF. It was over 400 people came here because they fought for this country. We don't know this, right? What we know, or what we think we know, is that there's all these people that came over here to try to find a better way of living. But what we also don't know, for instance, is that out in Barbados and the Caribbean, all round there at that time, it was under British rule. And they had told every single person over there that they were British. So these are the things that I often concern myself about, trying to uncover and unpick those stories. the stories that we don't know anything about, even though we should.
It's fascinating as well here in a city like Bradford, which is one of the most multicultural cities in the UK, if not on the planet. And you're talking about identity and history, and that becomes so varied when you look at the different communities, and the fact that those communities are now, having babies with each other, and where does your cultural heritage come from? Anything that jumped out? I mean, where did you start with the concepts of creating the piece? Did you start with a very specific message that you wanted to convey, or was it more about a process of exploring those themes?
I think it was more about exploration, and it started because I realised how much of the history of Bharatanatyam, which is the dance form that I have trained in, is whitewashed when we're learning about it as we're children. And it's kind of mythologized, and it's nice for children, I understand why it's done, but then even as adults we're not kind of open to the realities of its socio-political history, which is really interesting because it's very interconnected with the British Raj and partition around that time, and Home Rule and Gandhi. And so it was only as an adult that I sought it and I found out about it, and I was really mind blown because it helped me understand myself as a classical Indian dancer today, and because I don't feel like an antiquity, but I'm often treated like one. But I needed to understand, and actually the resurrection of the art form is very recent. It's not ancient by any means, and these exotic terms are always used, and I was finding myself feeling like I wasn't relevant by what I heard, but not what I felt. And so it was because of the whitewashed history of Bharatanatyam that I then sort of looked at what else, and I think the obvious thing is that, the British Empire and those sorts of things, and I think the reason we didn't locate the work in a particular place or a particular time, or we make references to Australia and the British Empire and America and lots of other things, is that I didn't want it to be one person's story. I didn't want it to be my story or somebody's story that I was paraphrasing. I wanted it just to be a place where you can understand how it happened everywhere, past and present. That's why we don't locate it, whether it's a recent past or a further past history. It's still, it's still relevant to us. It was more about the connection between past and future and present that was interesting to me.
And so, I mean, it's an interesting point about looking, and I think you've touched on this here, about looking at your art form and the kind of, and almost deconstructing your art form. Is that a process that you both had to go through within your individual art forms, within your practice?
I think something that really just echoes with me there is that the idea of, because you said it was kind of like this childlike kind of, as a child this is what you were taught. And the thing that was interesting for me was that the two times where you had it's the childish narration, story time, fairy tale kind of thing, but also then at the end you have that really parody kind of exaggerated thing. But the weird thing is that actually the thing that at least I found quite jarring was that actually neither of those was so far from what is the narrative. So although it's easy to be like, oh, that was really kind of comical or hyperbole, actually that is also exactly what we're told. So it was kind of jarring.
Yeah, and that's the thing, in the process of doing it, I really, dance is a funny one because I think people worry about narrative in dance and it becomes, trite or cheesy or musical theatre, but part of it is that this sort of crude and simplified and happy-clappy talking is how really confident, Trump does it all the time. I'm awesome, I'm just really great, isn't it beautiful, wasn't it great before? And so actually, since I'm the whitewasher from the beginning, I'm not changing characters, I'm always that person. I'm just convincing you because that's what people who are in those positions do. They speak nicely and they have nice music to convince you. And to be honest, I don't know how it would have been taken had I been white and doing the same work. I think it would be very different. I think I have the power to convince more because people already know what they want to see half the time, whether they realise it or not. They like the nice things. So even the Bharatanatyam that I use at the beginning is not Bharatanatyam. It's very exotified. It's curly-whirly. It's how people think of Indian dance. It's not really, and so to use that was a really interesting kind of process for me too, to take my form, which I feel really passionately about, that is understood well, and do that to it, just for the sake of sucking people in, I guess,
And because it's what the voyeur kind of expects and wants.
So if you can play on that, you can play on an element of what's desired, an element of something productive, an element of something easy. You know.
That's so interesting, because the very first thing that you did there, I just thought of journeying, and I thought of waves, and I thought about the travels that the black community had to do to go from one place to the other, because we were being told things like, you know, piece of paper, gold, and all this stuff. That kind of the sense of the mother country calling. You know, that kind of like our country is one thing, but actually we're part of this much bigger thing. This bigger thing incorporates us all, and it actually never did.
And it had promises.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's so interesting hearing what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, it's funny because it's such a bold and direct narrative. Sometimes I think some of the comments have been with other shows that we don't allow the audience, Lena and I, the choreographer and director, and myself, we don't allow the audience to go outside of there. It's just really like, here it is, this is what it is. But then I think that if you watch it again, or the more you kind of think back on it, there are kind of little subtle things that are going on all the way through, whether it's in the language. Again, language is very important in this work. Someone asked me yesterday when we did a show in London, could we do this without the text? And I said, I'm sure we could, but I don't think we would get to the heart of the work as quickly, because people will be fighting for that part. And actually, I think I prefer them to fight later on, when they got inside, not at the beginning, not right at the beginning.
I do think there's something really interesting that you said there about dance struggling with narrative, and I know for myself, I trained at Rambert School, which is like a very well-known ballet school, and as a black girl from Hackney, that was not the thing that you did, right? And so, I had to find a way of bringing my narrative, but that got transformed and shifted and changed into this very whitewashed version of me that has never really sat comfortably with me. Not that I really thought about it that much, but there were points where it was made very apparent that, I'm different. That I'm not supposed to be doing the dancing thing that I'm supposed to be. Do you know what I mean? There's all this sense of that, but that sense of narrative is the thing that I've always had from the get-go.
I think what people don't realise is that even, within sort of dance and contemporary arts and culture in the West especially, is that, abstract is seen as this sort of higher form of something, and then the narrative cheapens it almost. But actually what they don't realise when people think in this way, whether they realise it or not, is that actually many cultures outside of the West function on narrative, function through storytelling, and that kind of thing. It's an inherent part of their classical arts, like Bharatanatyam is. It's not cheap at all. It's actually an inherent part of it. So there's a real hierarchy that I feel that we're often fighting.
And I think it's not even like that's just accidental. So part of that colonising is also, and I think what I liked is that because this was also quite a feminized history, in the sense that dance is seen as feminine, the hair thing, and it's interesting because not only is it kind of the narrative about the past that is whitewashed, but the sources that we see as valid forms of knowledge from the past. So, in my own experience, I've done a lot of oral histories, and within the way they're received in academia is that, you need proper evidence to back up what these women said. And I was doing oral histories with migrant women. So there are no other sources, because the only other sources would be kind of government and council records, which are, statistical. They don't tell you anything about those women's lives. And so I thought that was really interesting as well, that you used those kind of modes. And for me, because I do spoken word poetry, but that's obviously it's very much about narrative, but without it was just interesting to see bringing the dance and the physical into that narrative, because in a way it was it's like this way that you can rupture what you're you can say two things at the same time, right? So that was really interesting to me, because that's not something I do in my work, but it was like, okay, yeah, you could be saying one thing, but you're clearly feeling something else, or you're clearly or you're even being somebody else at the time that you're saying something. So
I think behind the screen we work with that more than at the beginning. So at the beginning it's all, it's one-to-one, come with me, you know what's going on. And so then when you start to shift what's going on, where, the words aren't heard anymore, there's a happiness, there's a psychosis almost. But then, the physical violence in the movement, I think that's an interesting thing for me to do, actually, as well as, when we created it and thinking about it.
Watching it, one of the things that that struck me, and I wonder whether any of you have any idea, but it feels like there is a bigger issue, and I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about how we could tackle that wider issue about cultural whitewashing. And I've been thinking for about 5 minutes of how I can phrase this question. I'm not really sure how to get it, but it's very interesting that almost all, I can't even think of another example about people who are looking at cultural appropriation, at these topics, do not tend to be white artists. And it feels like if we're going to change that conversation that actually made last week, we have to find a way that people from white British communities are also asking those questions and are also exploring what that means. And I think, you know, as we get multiculturalism within our cities and, you know, and people's heritage becomes more diverse, I think people are more likely to start asking those questions. But I wonder whether any of you have any ideas about how we could go about starting that conversation with the wider group of people.
I think some, I was going to say a good practice kind of example, because I think we have to differentiate between sort of individuals getting involved with this and then also like the actual holders of power, because that's what's going to matter. But so Glasgow University very recently just did research into their own university funds to find out what the links with the slave trade were. And so they found that from all the endowments historically and the benefactors, so this is like links to either money that was sort of invested in plantations or in slave owning or the slave trade, so that's like a few different facets of it. It was like, in today's prices, it would be between 16 and 198 million pounds. And I think what's good about them doing that research is that it acknowledges, okay, we had direct investment in white supremacy and colonisation, but also what they're doing with that money now is to fund a centre for the study of slavery and kind of looking into all of that. And I think, because I personally think that it's very hard to change institutions. I don't know if we can sort of reverse what's happened, but what we can do is try to tell that under-narrative, that narrative that hasn't been told. So we call this modernity, we could also call it colonisation, right? So it's that thing of can we turn it around, and if we can put the resources into it. So that's just an example that I kind of sprung to mind when you said that, but I think it's interesting.
I mean, this is a big well, okay, I'm going to be really blunt. I don't think it's going to change.
Okay.
And the reason being is because whiteness, and I'm using that as a construct. Whiteness, Robin DiAngelo talks about it in her book White Fragility. She says that whiteness is the system through which politically, economically and all the other ways it kind of holds itself above everybody else. So when you have a society like Britain, which is predominantly white, actually white is seen as normal and everything else is seen as different, other, lesser. Right? So we're living in a country whereby, in terms of my family being here, you know, we were inserted into the laws here. We weren't there wasn't a set of laws that was like constructed especially for us. Yeah. You know, for myself, I was born and raised here in London. However, I was not seen as a British citizen until 1983. Because my mum and dad come from Barbados, even though Barbados was actually part of the Commonwealth, and before that was part of the British Empire, and by definition was actually British. So I think when you're talking about kind of like sense of like how can we start to have these deeper conversations, there's a part of me that kind of goes, I don't think we can. I genuinely don't think we can, because I think what whiteness always seems to do is it rails against any kind of questioning of itself, right? So, you know, I don't know if anybody saw Piers Morgan speaking to Dr. Gehendi Andrews the other day. Andrews was talking about Churchill. Churchill was an out-and-out racist. He was also sexist. We know that, you know, God knows how many people he killed, you know, in order to protect Britain. So Candy Andrews, who knows about this stuff, was saying this. And it was so amazing. What Piers Morgan did, I think, absolutely typifies what whiteness does. Rather than listen to him, the first thing that came out of his mouth was, why is it that you as a black man don't like being here? Why don't you just go home? And that right there is the problem. Look, well, you say it's Piers Morgan, but actually, I've
He's on the television though. I just can't believe he gets his airtime.
Yeah, oh no, well, yeah, that's true too. No, it's all right, it's all right. But you know, that I often get, where are you really from? Right? I will say London, and it's like people are not hearing me. No, where are you really from? You're obviously not from London. Excuse me? Can you not hear my accent? I mean, what is that? So, you know, I don't think we can. I think what we can do is shed a light through the art that we're doing and cause the question, and in the hope that maybe these small conversations will kickstart something further down the line.
Well, part of my question was good. So I hear absolutely what you're saying there. So one of my questions would be, do you think these problems will still be as well in 2 generations' time?
Well, I think.
Go on.
I just think we need to think about the way we're talking about it, right? Because it's these problems. As in, I just don't think we can call them problems. I think actually what this is for the last 500 years since the colonization of the Americas. This is what Europe is built on. Essentially, these narratives, and actual economic investments, but then also sort of ideological investments. So 2 generations' time, I definitely think we'll be because I think we've just started scratching the surface. Do you know what I mean? It's just recently that we've gone, hang on, all these people who are not white in this country are here because we were there, as the saying goes. But I think 2 generations' time, maybe we're having more interesting conversations. But I think it's actually about understanding how power works, and it's the investment in those narratives. It's not that the narrative exists. So I think Jeremy Corbyn the other day said that we need to start teaching about, forget Black History Month, we need to just teach Black history as like all the time. And that's great, and that's a great first step. But I do think my other kind of thing that I'm kind of cautious about is capitalism, by which I mean that what you're seeing as well is that this has become a trendy thing now to talk about the colonization of history, to talk about, and it's interesting to me that, a lot of universities are starting to marketize themselves on a basis of like, we teach more radical history here, so give £9,000 to come here. No, but it's true. And then interestingly, in the arts as well, to see kind of there are places that are like, we're looking for radical work, and that's all well and good. But we know what it's interesting because is my question, and this is when I wrap up with myself, is this just another way that we're asked to appropriate our histories for this kind of neoliberal gaze now that kind of says it's amazing that we're talking about racism, that's great. And yet we're not talking about the power and how to shift the power and how, because power is held in institutions, and I think it has to be more than just talking about it. But
I agree.
I mean, it's funny actually. Just in the last few performances of this, we've had a few reviews, and I've been really curious how white people talk about this work, and it's like not everyone, but I noticed things in the language used, that there's a difference in what the sort of Afro-analysis lady talked about and went right to the heart of the work in its first iteration that we brought out in 2 years ago, and how Asian Culture Vulture writes about it. But then, the commentary around it in the Western sort of media has been really. That was a nice attempt, and it's difficult to say, well, actually, maybe we didn't get everything right in the show. We're still, there's still things we know we need to refine, and it's all about resource. But I think to talk about music being too loud, or my big eyes, and that has nothing to do with the work, and it's just like you have this much airtime in your column or whatever, and you talk about that. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Whereas someone. An Asian woman who wrote me a comment and sent it to me talks about how the structures of the ship feel like they're structures that we can't fit into, and it was just so intelligent, and I just find it really strange that there's this kind of that was nice, it's a sincere attempt at something, it's whatever, and it's looking at the craftsmanship and not the politics of it.
Do you think that's potentially because for some of those reviewers and some of those audience that kind of regular attenders, there is a risk that this sort of work is seen as kind of tokenistic because only this sort of work is dealing with these issues, and actually it's not part of the mainstream stuff, and actually what there needs to be is that this could act as a provocation, so that some of this stuff is actually being seen more more widely, more broadly, so you're not just treated as a kind of...
I mean, so many audience members, even yesterday and across the last few shows, have one, you know, like, oh, we didn't know about this, you know, we would have told loads more people. You know, they really understood the heart of the work, and they went straight into the kind of the politics of it, and not just about, oh, what do you use for that white? Does it come off your skin? I mean, you know what I mean? And that's why I think, you know, it's a shame that can't be infiltrated into the kind of language, because people who do talk about this, who have readerships, have a power there in themselves, have a use of language in themselves. And I think if you look at how much a reviewer might write about, you know, a ballet dancer and how extraordinary that will be, like column inches, you know, the length of my arm. I just remember when I was at, sorry, this is random, but at junior school, you know, every week there would be a person talking about the football updates that the school had been playing. There'd be a girl and then a boy, and then a girl talking about volleyball. The boys would literally be there marking through every move that every single person did, every like wink and blink and breathing in, breathing out. And the women would just literally just say, this is what the score was, or blah. And it's just this, again, it's about the importance that you choose to put on these things, and understanding what your readership is, that actually you might have some influence in that.
Because also then they're complicit in the token. Like,
Yeah,
token
I think that's more than.
Yeah.
I don't feel tokenistic
Right.
in this.
Yeah.
This is something I want
No,
to
it
do,
was more
but
perception,
but in the
yeah.
perception of a venue, yes, I do believe that's something.
Do you think you have a particular challenge working within an art form like Bharatanatyam as well, which can be more rigid in its structure than other art forms?
I mean, I feel like the deeper I go into Bharatanatyam, the more I realise, the more tools I feel like I have, the bigger my skill set. And it's just about who I work with and how I work with it. Because actually, you're right, I think with the numerous choreographers I've worked with over the years, they end up just making me do gestural stuff, standing on the spot. But, you know, working with Lena, we expanded that vocabulary. And actually, I felt challenged in my Bharatanatyam sort of training, because there's such a lot of expression in there, the nuance of that, which, you know, challenges me in the way that Bharatanatyam challenges me as well. It is different, but I feel very much that my skills were being pushed. They weren't within their boundaries, and a lot of choreographers who don't know what to do with someone like me just make me do what I can do, the gestural stuff in my sleep. It's not a challenge for me. But this was expanding a lot of that. And yeah, I think Bharatanatyam is still finding those things, and I, you know, just one of the people doing that.
I wonder whether you've all got like a closing comment, a closing statement, if there's anything that, you know, you looked that you'd like people to take away from it, or a provocation that we could all think about on the back of that, or just something that really resonated with you from this evening's performance.
Yeah, okay. I think the thing that resonated with me most was the screen, the whitewashing, the kind of trying to, I saw it as trying to wipe away this bizarre history and try to present a version that actually makes sense. But you have this shadow of racism constantly in your ear, that shadow of the elongated arms, and kind of like the soundtrack as well, it sounded pretty demonic to me. You know, that there actually epitomizes for me what my daily existence is.
You're not the first person to say
Right.
that.
I bet I'm not.
No, the very first
Yeah.
iteration, because this is one image that never left. This was already in the show from the very beginning. Other things have changed, but a lady in the first show that we did said, you know, there's something in that part in this show that speaks of my experience that I haven't been able to put into words.
Yeah.
And you know, that was really.
Yeah. It's amazing. I mean, you know, I was actually quite struck by that, and it's more of a question. Imagine your daily existence and everything around you is telling you you're crap, or you're lesser, or people are talking to you as if you're stupid or you're dumb, or people are talking over you. Imagine that all the time. That image of the person, of this kind of spectre, kind of constantly in the ear, That is what racism is. That is what I feel I'm having to live with. And I just want, just try it for a week. Just have a look. Just see for yourselves. Like, what do you notice? When there's a person of colour in the room, how do everybody then kind of manage themselves around that person?
And I think also, how do we believe them? Because it's
Yeah.
also a question of whether your truth is believed. If you're
Absolutely.
looking out this way, but we're all looking that way, and no one's going to believe if you talk about what you can see because we can't see it.
That's right.
And I think it's also that question, and that just, I guess I'll finish on this as well, but it reminded me immediately when I saw that of, it's the first time I had a visual representation of, there's this really famous post-colonial work called Can the Subaltern Speak? And it's all about, if we're looking into history and we're trying to look at, and it's particularly looking at South Asia and South Asian women historically, who, again, there's no records of these women, so the question that she asked the actress to be back is, can these women speak to us from history? Because, there's no sources, so what do we do? How do we tell their narratives? There's no record. And a response that somebody wrote is, the question is not can the subaltern speak, but can we hear? Are we listening? And I think that is really interesting because you were speaking back there and you were saying something, but we had no idea what. And then when you said the thing about, can you believe it if you see it? What about if you hear it? What about if you see? And it was like, it just speaks to what you're saying, because it's like, there are so many ways we can talk about racism and colonization, but at what stage will it stop being about persuasion, I guess?
Yeah.
And I think Toni Morrison says it beautifully. She says that one of the main functions of racism is distraction, that you will be asked, well, prove you have a history, so you spend 20 years proving that you have a history. You will be asked, well, your skulls just aren't as big, so you spend 20 years proving that they are. And all these kinds of things. And she says in that end, well, now you're 80 years old and we have time to do the actual work. So, yeah, I think on that note, for me, it would just be, the onus can't just be on the artists and the provokers and the resistors. It also has to be on those of us who just, can this just be about voyeuring and just like consuming that piece of work, or can we think about whether we're listening in our own practice, in our own lives?
Thank you, all of you, for your
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
So
It was really interesting. Seeta, thank you for a beautiful performance this evening and providing us with the thought-provoking material for it. So thank you. And if anyone would just like to join me in just a quick round of applause.